I was 12 years old when I learned that the sky could fall. It fell on my father first, and then, piece by piece over the years that followed, it fell on everything I had ever believed about love, about justice, and about the men who build empires from the wreckage of other men's dreams. My name is Clara Ashworth, and for 14 years I carried my father's shame like a stone sewn into the lining of my chest. Edmund Ashworth, the papers had called him. Visionary, madman. The engineer who believed he could lay railways in the clouds, and who died proving that some dreams are too heavy for the air to hold. The Celestine, his magnificent airship, had been meant to revolutionize travel, to carry passengers in unprecedented luxury along sky rails suspended between mountain peaks, defying gravity itself through a combination of hydrogen lift and electromagnetic propulsion that my father had spent his life perfecting. On its inaugural voyage through the Cumbrian Mountains in the autumn of 1873, it had fallen from the sky like a wounded bird, killing all 43 souls aboard, including the man who had taught me to see wonder in the turning of gears and the hiss of steam. I remember the morning the news came. I remember my mother's face going white as bone, her hand reaching for the doorframe as if the floor had suddenly tilted beneath her. I remember the way silence filled our house in the days that followed, a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. And I remember, with a clarity that has never dimmed, the parade of creditors who came afterward, stripping our home of everything my father had built, everything he had loved, until my mother and I were left standing in empty rooms that echoed with the ghost of a life we would never recover. My mother did not survive the winter. The doctor called it pneumonia, but I knew better even then. She died of grief, of shame, of the unbearable weight of watching everything she had believed in crumble to dust. I was sent to live with my Aunt Prudence in a cramped house in Cheapside, where I learned quickly that dreams were dangerous things, that ambition was a sin, and that the only safety in this world lay in making oneself small, invisible, and utterly unremarkable. For 14 years, I did exactly that. I learned to keep my head down, my voice soft, my expectations modest. I took a position as a junior clerk at Hartley & Sons Insurance, a dim and dusty office where I spent my days copying policy numbers into ledgers and my nights in a narrow room that smelled of coal smoke and regret. I told myself that this was enough, that survival was its own kind of victory, that the daughter of Edmund Ashworth had no right to want anything more than the quiet obscurity that scandal had prescribed for her. And then, on an unremarkable Tuesday in March of 1887, I found the ledger that would unravel everything I thought I knew. It was meant to be destroyed. That was what Mr. Hartley had said when he handed me the box of old files, his voice carrying that particular weariness that seemed to define every interaction in our office. Old claims, he told me, from before his time, destined for the incinerator in the basement where the ghosts of other people's misfortunes went to finally rest. I was to sort through them first, he said, salvaging any documents that might still hold legal relevance, and consigning the rest to the flames. I worked through the box methodically, the way I did everything in those days, without curiosity, without engagement, simply moving papers from one pile to another like an automaton, performing its designated function: birth certificates, property assessments, shipping manifests, claim denials, the detritus of lives I would never know, reduced to ink and paper and the faint smell of mildew. And then my hands touched leather, soft, worn leather, the color of dried blood, embossed with a symbol I would have recognized anywhere: a winged wheel surrounded by laurel leaves, the crest of the Ashworth Aeronautical Company, my father's company. For a long moment, I could not breathe. I simply sat there, my fingers resting on that familiar symbol, feeling the leather warm beneath my touch, as if the book itself were alive, as if it had been waiting all these years for me to find it. When I finally opened it, my hands were trembling so badly that I nearly dropped it. The route ledger of the Celestine. That was what the first page said, written in my father's own hand. The elegant script I remembered from birthday cards and letters and the notes he used to leave on my pillow when he worked late into the night. Below the title were dates, coordinates, calculations, all recorded with the meticulous precision that had defined everything my father did. This was his logbook, his record of every test flight, every route calculation, every adjustment to the Celestine's revolutionary guidance system. This was the document that should have been in the airship's navigation room when it fell. The document that had supposedly been destroyed in the crash. Yet here it was, in a box of old insurance files, in a basement office in London, 14 years after my father's death. I turned the pages slowly, reverently, drinking in the sight of his handwriting like water after a long drought. Most of the entries were technical, filled with numbers and angles and meteorological observations that I only partially understood. But as I approached the final pages, the entries from the days leading up to the inaugural voyage, something changed. The handwriting grew more hurried, more agitated. Certain passages had been underlined multiple times, the pen pressed so hard it had nearly torn through the paper. And then I reached the entry for October 17th, 1873. The day of the crash. The route my father had recorded for that day was not the route that had been announced to the passengers and the press. The Celestine was supposed to travel from Windermere to Keswick, a relatively gentle path through the lower valleys, avoiding the treacherous peaks of Helvellyn and Skiddaw. But according to my father's ledger, the actual programmed route was entirely different. The airship had been set to fly directly through the highest and most dangerous section of the range, along a course that would take it into an area known for sudden downdrafts and unpredictable wind shears. Below the route coordinates, my father had written a single sentence, underlined 3 times. This is not my navigation. Someone has changed the calculation engine settings. The ship will not survive this course. I read those words once, twice, 3 times, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Someone had sabotaged the Celestine. Someone had deliberately programmed a fatal route and let my father take the blame for a disaster he had tried to prevent. And someone, all those years ago, had hidden this ledger in an insurance company's archives, perhaps to destroy it later, perhaps simply to ensure it would never be found. But found it had been. And now I knew. The crash was no accident. My father was no fool, no madman, no reckless dreamer who had gambled with other people's lives. He had been murdered. They all had been murdered. And whoever had done it had walked away not just free but triumphant, building an empire on the ashes of my father's stolen legacy. It did not take me long to discover who that person was. Even in my years of deliberate ignorance, of willful blindness to anything connected to the world my father had inhabited, I had heard the name. Everyone had heard the name. Lord Nathaniel Vane, the celebrated industrialist, the architect of Britain's revolutionary sky rail network, the man who had transformed aerial transportation from a curiosity into a cornerstone of modern commerce. The newspapers called him a visionary. Parliament called him a national treasure. The Queen herself had knighted him for his contributions to the empire's technological supremacy. What the newspapers did not mention, what I discovered only after weeks of quiet research in public records offices and newspaper archives, was that Nathaniel Vane had been my father's junior partner in the early development of the Skyrail technology. He had been 23 years old at the time of the crash, a brilliant young engineer who had worked alongside my father on the electromagnetic propulsion systems that made the Celestine possible. And 6 months after the disaster, when my father's patents had been sold at auction to pay his debts, Nathaniel Vane had purchased every single one of them for a fraction of their true value. He had built his empire on my father's bones. And now, holding this ledger in my trembling hands, I knew that he had built it on my father's blood as well. I should have gone to the authorities. I know that now, just as I knew it then. I should have taken the ledger to Scotland Yard, to the newspapers, to anyone who might have listened and believed. But I had lived too long in the shadow of scandal to trust that truth alone would be enough. I was the disgraced daughter of a disgraced man, a nobody clerk with no connections, no money, no credibility. Nathaniel Vane was one of the most powerful men in England, with friends in Parliament, in the peerage, in the very institutions I might have turned to for justice. If I accused him without proof beyond this single ledger, if I tried to bring him down and failed, I would be destroyed utterly and the truth would be buried forever. No. I needed more. I needed evidence that could not be dismissed, witnesses who could not be silenced, documents that would expose not just the crime, but the criminal. And to get that evidence, I would have to get close to Nathaniel Vane himself. It was not as difficult as I had feared. Vane was known to employ an extensive household staff at his country estate in Derbyshire, Thornfield Hall, where he spent most of his time overseeing the construction of his newest and most ambitious project, a sky rail line that would connect Manchester to Edinburgh through a series of suspended stations built into the peaks of the Pennines. His current secretary had recently left his employ under circumstances that the gossip columns described as sudden and mysterious, and he was known to be seeking a replacement. I applied for the position under my mother's maiden name, Clara Merriweather, presenting myself as the daughter of a respectable but impoverished family in Surrey. My references were forged. My history a careful construction of half-truths and outright lies. But my skills were genuine. 14 years of clerical work had made me efficient, organized, and above all, invisible, the perfect candidate for a position that required discretion and demanded nothing more than quiet competence. I received the letter of acceptance on a gray morning in early April. Lord Vane would expect me at Thornfield Hall within the week. My duties would include correspondence, scheduling, and the management of his personal archive. My salary would be generous, my accommodations private, my position one of considerable trust. I read the letter standing by the window of my narrow room, watching the rain streak down the glass like tears. In 7 days, I would enter the home of the man who had destroyed my father. I would smile at him, serve him, make myself indispensable to him while I searched for the evidence that would bring him to ruin. I would look into the face of my enemy and feel nothing but cold, patient hatred. Or so I told myself. I could not have known then how thoroughly those plans would unravel, or how completely Nathaniel Vane would come to occupy not just my thoughts, but my heart. I could not have known that the enemy I sought would prove to be something far more complicated than a villain, or that the truth I was so desperate to uncover would force me to question everything I believed about justice, about love, and about the nature of forgiveness itself. All I knew, standing at that rain-streaked window with his letter in my hand, was that I was finally going to learn what had really happened to the Celestine. And I was prepared to sacrifice everything, including myself, to see that justice was done. The journey to Derbyshire took the better part of 2 days, a progression from the smoke-choked streets of London through the gradually greening countryside of the Midlands, until at last the carriage began to climb into the hills above Matlock. I had brought little with me. A small trunk containing my few respectable dresses, a case with my writing materials, and the personal effects I could not bear to leave behind. And hidden in a false compartment beneath my undergarments, wrapped in oilcloth and prayer, the route ledger of the Celestine. I could not risk leaving it in London, where Aunt Prudence might find it, where a fire or a burglary might destroy it before I could use it. It would stay with me, close to my heart, until I had gathered enough evidence to ensure that its revelations could never be silenced. Thornfield Hall appeared through the mist like something from a fever dream, all gray stone and Gothic towers, perched on a ridge overlooking a valley where I could see the skeletal framework of a sky rail station under construction. The house was enormous, far grander than anything I had imagined, with wings that seemed to sprawl in every direction and windows that reflected the pale afternoon light like dozens of watchful eyes. As the carriage rolled through the gates, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the April wind. This was the house that my father's death had built. Every stone, every window, every carefully manicured acre of grounds had been purchased with the patents and reputation that should have belonged to the Ashworth family. I was entering the monument to my own dispossession. The housekeeper who met me at the door was a thin, severe woman named Mrs. Blackwood, whose eyes assessed me with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to evaluating the worth of strangers in a single glance. She found me acceptable, apparently, for she led me through the entrance hall without comment, up a grand staircase, and down a long corridor to the rooms that would be mine for the duration of my employment. They were comfortable, if not luxurious. A small sitting room adjoined to a bedroom, with a view of the eastern gardens, furnished in the heavy dark wood that seemed to dominate every corner of the house. I would meet Lord Vane at dinner, Mrs. Blackwood informed me. Until then, I was free to settle myself and rest from my journey. She hoped I would be comfortable. She hoped I would find my duties agreeable. And she hoped, with a particular emphasis that I did not fully understand at the time, that I would not be easily frightened. I asked her what she meant by that. She merely smiled, a thin expression that did not reach her eyes, and said that Thornfield Hall was a very old house with very long memories. Sometimes, she said, those memories made themselves known in ways that newcomers found unsettling. But I should not be alarmed. The house meant no harm. It was simply restless, like its master. She left me then, and I stood alone in my new rooms, listening to the wind moan through the chimneys and wondering what I had gotten myself into. A restless house, a restless master. And somewhere within these walls, the evidence I needed to destroy them both. I did not know then that Thornfield Hall would come to feel more like home than any place I had lived since childhood. I did not know that its shadows would shelter me, its secrets would sustain me, and its master would become the axis around which my entire existence would turn. I knew only that I was there for justice, for vengeance, for the restoration of my father's name. I knew only that I hated Nathaniel Vane with every fiber of my being. How strange, then, that within a fortnight of my arrival, I would begin to understand that hatred and love are not opposites but neighbors, separated by a wall so thin that a single word can breach it. I first saw him that evening, descending the main staircase as I waited in the entrance hall to be summoned to dinner. I had dressed carefully, choosing my plainest dark blue gown, styling my hair in a simple knot that emphasized my role as an employee rather than a guest. I wanted to be unremarkable. I wanted to be forgettable. I wanted him to see me as nothing more than a useful piece of machinery, a secretary who would manage his correspondence and fade into the wallpaper the moment she was not needed. The entrance hall was a cathedral of shadows at that hour, lit only by the flickering gas lamps that lined the walls and the dying embers of a fire in the massive stone hearth. Portraits of Vane ancestors looked down from their gilded frames, their painted eyes seeming to follow my movements as I paced the black and white marble floor. Above me, the vaulted ceiling disappeared into darkness, and I could hear the wind moaning through the chimneys like the voices of the restless dead. I was studying a particularly severe-looking portrait of what appeared to be a Georgian-era admiral when I heard footsteps on the stairs. They were measured, unhurried, the footsteps of a man accustomed to commanding his own domain. I turned, prepared to offer the proper deference to my new employer, and felt the world tilt beneath my feet. Whatever I had expected Nathaniel Vane to be, the reality was something altogether different. He was tall, taller than I had imagined from the illustrations in the newspapers, with broad shoulders and a lean, angular frame that moved with the coiled grace of a predator at rest. His hair was dark, nearly black, swept back from a forehead that spoke of intelligence and intensity in equal measure. His features were sharp, almost severe, with high cheekbones and a jaw that seemed to have been carved from the same stone as his house. He wore evening dress, but there was something disheveled about him, a loosened cravat, a smudge of what might have been machine oil on his cuff. that suggested he had only recently emerged from his workshop and had not taken the time to fully compose himself. But it was his eyes that arrested me, that made me forget for one terrible moment why I was there and what I had come to do. They were gray, the gray of storm clouds and steel in the sea before a tempest, and when they met mine, I felt as if I had been stripped bare, as if every secret I carried had been laid open for his inspection. There was intelligence in those eyes, and intensity, and something else I could not name, something that looked almost like recognition, as if he too felt the strange electricity that seemed to crackle in the air between us. The gas lamps flickered as he descended the final steps, casting his face alternately in light and shadow, and I found myself unable to look away. In the newspapers, he had appeared cold, distant, a man carved from marble and ambition. In person, he was something far more unsettling. He was alive, vibrantly, disturbingly alive, with a presence that seemed to fill the entire hall, that made the portraits fade into insignificance and the shadows retreat to the corners. He stopped at the foot of the stairs and regarded me with an expression I could not read. There was curiosity there, and something that might have been amusement, but beneath it lay a weariness so profound that it seemed to emanate from his very bones. This was not the face of a triumphant villain. This was the face of a man who carried weights invisible to the world, whose victories had cost him something precious. "Miss Merriweather, I presume," he said, and his voice was low and quiet, with a roughness to it that suggested he did not use it often for casual conversation. "Welcome to Thornfield Hall. I trust your journey was not too arduous." I curtsied, grateful for the formal gesture that allowed me to look away from those penetrating eyes. "Not at all, my lord," I said, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. "The countryside is beautiful. I found the journey most pleasant." He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been skepticism. "The countryside is deceptive," he said. "It looks peaceful from a distance. It is only when you climb into the hills that you realize how treacherous the terrain can be. But you will learn that soon enough. Come. Mrs. Blackwood tells me dinner is ready, and I have learned not to keep her waiting." He offered me his arm, a courtesy I had not expected and did not know how to refuse. As I placed my fingers on his sleeve, I could feel the warmth of him through the fabric, could sense the controlled power in the muscles beneath. This close, I could smell him too, a combination of sandalwood and machine oil that spoke of long hours in his workshop and brief concessions to gentlemanly grooming. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was, in fact, dangerously appealing, and I hated myself for noticing it. We walked to the dining room in silence, a vast space where a single table had been set for two beneath a chandelier that sparkled with the light of 100 candles. He seated me himself, another unexpected courtesy, and took his place across from me. For a long moment, he simply looked at me, those gray eyes assessing, measuring, searching for something I could not identify. "Mrs. Blackwood tells me you have experience in document management," he said finally, as the servants began to bring in the first course. "That you worked for an insurance firm in London. A tedious occupation, I should think. What made you leave it?" I had prepared for this question, had rehearsed my answer until it felt as natural as breathing. "I was looking for a change of scenery, my lord," I said, "and the opportunity to work in a household of such distinction was not one I could pass by." Distinction. He repeated the word as if tasting it, finding it bitter. Is that what they call it now? I had thought they called it something rather less flattering. The mad inventor's mansion. The house that hubris built. I have heard the whispers, Miss Merriweather. I am not unaware of how the world sees me. I did not know how to respond to that. There was no self-pity in his voice, no plea for contradiction or reassurance. He was simply stating a fact, acknowledging a truth that most men in his position would have preferred to ignore. It was the first indication I had that Nathaniel Vane was not the straightforward villain I had constructed in my imagination. "The world sees what it wishes to see, my lord," I said carefully. "I prefer to form my own judgments." Do you?" He leaned forward slightly, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, something that might have been interest or might have been warning. "That is either very wise or very dangerous, Miss Merriweather. In my experience, people who insist on forming their own judgments often discover truths they would rather not have known. Are you certain you wish to take that risk?" I met his gaze as steadily as I could, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "I am not afraid of the truth, my lord," I said, "whatever it may be." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth lifted in what might have been a smile. "Good," he said. "Then perhaps you will survive Thornfield Hall after all. It has a way of destroying those who prefer comfortable lies. But those who can face the truth, even when it is ugly, even when it hurts, they are the ones who find a home here." He turned his attention to his meal then, and for the rest of dinner our conversation was pleasant but unremarkable, touching on the progress of the Sky Rail construction, the management of his correspondence, the schedule of his upcoming engagements. He was courteous but distant, a man accustomed to keeping others at arm's length, and I found myself both relieved and strangely disappointed by his formality. It was only as I retired to my rooms that night, lying awake in the unfamiliar bed and listening to the wind howl around the towers of Thornfield Hall, that I realized how thoroughly he had unsettled me. I had come prepared to hate him. I had come armed with evidence of his crimes and a heart full of righteous fury. But sitting across from him at that candle-lit table, looking into those storm-gray eyes, I had felt something else entirely. Curiosity, recognition, the unsettling sense that we were not as different as I wanted to believe. I pushed the feeling aside and reminded myself of why I was there. The ledger was hidden in my room. My father's blood was on this man's hands. Whatever else Nathaniel Vane might be, however complex or compelling he might seem, he was still the architect of my family's destruction. I would do well to remember that. But even as I made that resolution, even as I hardened my heart against the dangerous sympathy I had begun to feel, I knew that something had shifted. The wall between hatred and fascination had developed its first crack. And though I did not know it then, that crack would widen with every passing day until there was no barrier left at all, until I stood exposed and defenseless before a truth that would change everything I thought I knew about the crash of the Celestine, about Nathaniel Vane, and about my own treacherous heart. My first weeks at Thornfield Hall passed in a blur of routine and careful observation. I learned the rhythms of the household, the preferences of its master, the gossip of the servants who regarded me with the polite suspicion reserved for newcomers in close-knit communities. I learned that Lord Vane rose before dawn and often did not sleep until well past midnight. I learned that he took his meals alone unless compelled by social obligation to do otherwise. I learned that he spent most of his time in the East Wing, where his private study and personal workshop were located, and that this wing was strictly off-limits to all but the most trusted members of the household. I also learned that Mrs. Blackwood had not exaggerated when she spoke of the house's restlessness. At night, when the gas lamps were extinguished and the corridors fell into shadow, I heard sounds that I could not explain. Footsteps in empty hallways, whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. And once, when I was returning to my room after a late night of work in the library, I saw a figure at the end of the corridor, a woman in a pale gown who stood motionless beneath a portrait of a man I did not recognize. I called out to her, thinking she must be one of the maids, but when I blinked, she was gone. There was no sound of retreating footsteps, no door opening or closing. She had simply vanished, as if she had never been there at all. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a figment of an overtired imagination. But I began to notice that the servants avoided that particular corridor after dark, and that the portrait before which the figure had stood was covered with a black cloth that no one would explain. When I asked Mrs. Blackwood about it, she merely pressed her lips together and said that some things were better left undisturbed. The house had its secrets, she told me. It was not my place to uncover them, but uncovering secrets was precisely what I had come to do. And as I settled into my position, I began to find opportunities to investigate without arousing suspicion. Lord Vane's personal archive, which occupied a large room adjacent to his study, contained decades of correspondence, contracts, patents, and technical documents. My official duty was to organize and catalog this material, a task that would take months and that gave me legitimate access to information that might otherwise have been beyond my reach. I worked methodically, beginning with the most recent files and gradually moving backward through time. Most of what I found was mundane, the ordinary business correspondence of a successful industrialist, but here and there I discovered hints of something darker. Letters from investors that spoke of certain arrangements and mutual understandings, phrased in language so carefully oblique that their true meaning was impossible to determine without context. Contracts that contained clauses so deliberately vague that their purpose remained maddeningly unclear. Financial records that showed payments to unnamed parties for unspecified services, the sums large enough to suggest something more significant than ordinary business expenses. I found references to meetings that had taken place in the weeks before the Celestine disaster, gatherings of men whose names I recognized from my research into my father's final days. Lord Pemberton had been a frequent correspondent. Sir Charles Whitmore appeared in several documents, his banker's hand evident in the careful structuring of investment agreements. And Marcus Blackwood, the parliamentarian who had led the official inquiry that exonerated the Skyrail industry of any responsibility for the crash, appeared again and again, his involvement in Vane's affairs far deeper than his public role would suggest. Each discovery strengthened my conviction that I was on the right track, that the truth I sought was hidden somewhere in these endless files waiting to be found. But I knew I would need something more definitive, something that could not be explained away as coincidence or legitimate business dealings. And that, I knew, was locked in the drawer nearest to Lord Vane's desk. I tried the drawer countless times in those first weeks, using hairpins, letter openers, even a small knife I had smuggled from the kitchen. Nothing worked. The lock was of an unusual design, requiring a key that I had never seen in Vane's possession and could not find despite my careful searching. I began to believe that he carried it with him always, perhaps on his watch chain or in some hidden pocket, never letting it out of his sight. And most intriguing of all, a locked drawer in the cabinet nearest to Lord Vane's desk, which resisted all my attempts to open it and which seemed to contain something he wished very much to keep hidden. I knew I would need to find the key to that drawer eventually, but I also knew that moving too quickly would be dangerous. Lord Vane was not a fool. If he suspected that I was anything other than what I claimed to be, if he caught me searching through his private papers without authorization, I would be dismissed instantly and might face consequences far worse than the loss of employment. I had to be patient. I had to earn his trust. And as the weeks passed and our daily interactions became more frequent, I found that earning his trust was far easier and far more complicated than I had anticipated. He was not what I had expected. That was the thought that returned to me again and again, late at night when I lay awake cataloging our conversations, analyzing his behavior, searching for the monster I had been so certain I would find. He was brilliant, yes, and occasionally arrogant, with a cutting intelligence that did not suffer fools gladly. But he was also kind in ways that seemed to surprise even himself. When he learned that one of the maids was struggling to support a sick mother, he arranged for the woman to be seen by his own physician and paid for her treatment without ever mentioning it to anyone. When a young engineer on the Skyrail project was injured in an accident, Lord Vane visited him every day until he recovered, sitting by his bedside and discussing technical problems as if the man were a colleague rather than an employee. And then there were the moments that I could not reconcile with the image of a ruthless criminal. The way he would pause sometimes in the middle of a conversation, his eyes going distant, his expression shadowed by something that looked very much like grief. The nightmares Mrs. Blackwood had mentioned, which I began to witness for myself as the weeks passed, hearing his cries echo through the corridors in the small hours of the morning, and the painting in his private study, the one he thought no one knew about, which I glimpsed one evening through a half-open door. It was a portrait of the Celestine, rendered in exquisite detail, and he stood before it with an expression of such profound sorrow that I had to turn away, my heart clenching with an emotion I did not want to feel. Was this the face of a man who had murdered 43 people for profit? Was this the cold-blooded schemer I had imagined, counting his gold while my father's body lay broken in the wreckage of his dreams? Or was it possible, just possible, that the truth was more complicated than I had allowed myself to believe? I did not want to consider that possibility. It would have been easier, so much easier, to maintain my hatred, to see Nathaniel Vane as nothing more than an obstacle to be overcome, an enemy to be destroyed. But the more time I spent in his presence, the more difficult that became. There was something between us, some connection I could not explain or deny, that seemed to strengthen with every conversation, every accidental touch, every moment when our eyes met and held for a beat too long. It happened gradually, so gradually that I did not recognize it for what it was until it was too late. A brush of fingers when he handed me a document. The warmth of his gaze when I made an observation that surprised him. The way my pulse quickened when I heard his footsteps in the corridor. The way my breath caught when he entered a room. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself I was merely playing a part, maintaining my cover, building the trust I needed to complete my mission. But late at night, alone in my room with the ledger hidden beneath my mattress, I knew that I was lying to myself. I was falling in love with the man I had come to destroy. And I did not know how to stop. The realization came to me gradually, like the slow dawning of light on a winter morning. I would catch myself thinking of him at odd moments, wondering what he was doing, what he was thinking, whether he was alone in his workshop with his blueprints and his ghosts. I would find excuses to linger in the corridors I knew he frequented, my heart quickening at the sound of his footsteps. I would replay our conversations in my mind, analyzing every word, every glance, every moment when his eyes had met mine and held. It was madness. It was betrayal. It was everything I had sworn I would never allow myself to feel, and yet I could not stop it. The more I tried to harden my heart against him, the more thoroughly he seemed to penetrate my defenses. He was not supposed to be kind. He was not supposed to be thoughtful. He was not supposed to look at me as if I were something rare and precious, as if my presence in his house was a gift he had not expected and did not quite know how to receive. There was a moment, one afternoon in the library, when our hands touched as we both reached for the same book. It was the briefest of contacts, a brush of fingers that lasted no more than a heartbeat, but I felt it like a brand, like a mark that would never fade. He pulled back immediately, muttering an apology, but not before I saw the color rise in his cheeks, not before I caught the way his breath had quickened. He felt it too. Whatever this impossible connection was, whatever force drew us together, despite everything that should have kept us apart, he felt it as strongly as I did. And that knowledge was both the most terrifying and the most exhilarating thing I had ever experienced. I began to dream of him, not the nightmares I had expected, not visions of accusation and revenge, but something far more disturbing. I dreamed of his hands on my skin, his mouth against mine, his voice whispering my name in the darkness. I would wake flushed and trembling, torn between shame and longing, cursing myself for my weakness even as I buried my face in my pillow and wished the dream would return. It was on a night in late May, nearly 2 months after my arrival at Thornfield Hall, that everything began to change. I had been working late in the archive, cataloging a particularly dense collection of technical documents, when I heard a sound that made me freeze in my chair. It was coming from the locked drawer, the one I had never been able to open. A faint scratching, as if something inside were trying to get out. I sat motionless for a long moment, listening. The scratching stopped, then started again, more insistent this time. It could have been a mouse, I told myself. A mouse that had somehow gotten trapped inside the drawer. But even as I formed the thought, I knew it was not true. There was something deliberate about the sound, something almost rhythmic, as if it were trying to communicate. I rose from my chair and approached the cabinet, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching grew louder as I drew near, and I thought I could hear something else beneath it, a whisper so faint I could not make out the words. My hand trembled as I reached for the drawer, knowing I could not open it, unable to stop myself from trying. And then, without warning, the drawer slid open. I stumbled backward, knocking my chair to the floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the entire house. For a long moment, I could only stare at the drawer, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. Inside, arranged in a neat stack, were letters. Dozens of letters, all addressed in the same handwriting, all bearing the same seal, the seal of Edmund Ashworth. My father's letters, hidden here, in Nathaniel Vane's private drawer, for 14 years. I do not know how long I stood there, frozen in shock and disbelief. It might have been seconds or it might have been hours. The candle on my desk had burned low, its flame guttering in a draught I could not feel, casting long shadows across the walls that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. The silence of the archive pressed against my ears like a physical weight, broken only by the distant ticking of a clock somewhere in the depths of the house and the wild, erratic pounding of my own heart. All I knew was that when I finally reached into the drawer and drew out the first letter, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. The parchment was yellowed with age, soft at the edges where it had been handled and rehandled over the years. I could smell it, a faint scent of ink and age and something else, something that might have been cologne or might have been tears dried long ago. The letter was dated September 1873, 1 month before the crash. It was addressed to Nathaniel Vane, and as I read it, the world I thought I knew collapsed around me. "My dear Nathaniel," it began, "I write to you in desperation, knowing that you may be my only hope. I have discovered something terrible, something that threatens not only the Celestine, but the lives of everyone who will board her on her inaugural voyage. The calculation engine has been tampered with. The navigation settings have been altered to send the ship on a course that will guarantee her destruction. I do not know who is responsible, but I suspect that our investors, the same men who have been pressuring me to surrender my patents, are behind this sabotage. I cannot go to the authorities. These men have connections everywhere, and I have no proof beyond my own observations. But I am writing to you because you are the only person I trust, the only one who might believe me and help me find a way to save the ship and everyone aboard. I know we have had our disagreements. I know you believe I have been too cautious in my approach to the business, but I beg you to set those differences aside and help me now. If we do not act quickly, 43 innocent people will die, and their blood will be on our hands. Please, Nathaniel, I am begging you. Do not let them destroy everything we have built. Your friend and partner, Edmund." The letter fell from my fingers as tears I could not control streamed down my face. My father had known. He had known about the sabotage, had tried to stop it, had reached out to the one person he thought he could trust. And Nathaniel Vane, the man I had spent 2 months growing to know and admire, and yes, love, had received that letter and done nothing. Had let my father board that ship knowing it was going to crash, had watched him die and then swooped in to claim his patents, his legacy, his life's work. The hatred I had felt when I first found the ledger was nothing compared to the fury that consumed me now. It was not merely that Vane had profited from my father's death. It was that my father had trusted him, had called him friend, had believed that their partnership, their shared dreams of sky rails and progress, meant something more than money and power. And Vane had betrayed that trust in the most absolute way imaginable. I gathered the letters with shaking hands, determined to read every one of them, to understand the full scope of his treachery before I confronted him. But before I could begin, the door to the archive opened, and I looked up to see Nathaniel Vane standing in the doorway. His face, when he saw what I was holding, went white as chalk. "Miss Merriweather," he said, and his voice was strange, hoarse, as if the words were being torn from him against his will. "What are you doing?" I should have lied. I should have made some excuse, some plausible explanation for why I was standing there with his secrets in my hands. But I was beyond lies now, beyond pretense, beyond the careful deception I had maintained for 2 months. I looked at him, at the man I had come to love and the monster I now knew him to be, and I said the words I had been waiting 14 years to say. "My name is not Clara Merriweather. My name is Clara Ashworth. Edmund Ashworth was my father, and you killed him." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. He did not move, did not speak, simply stood there staring at me with an expression I could not read. And then, slowly, he crossed the room until he was standing before me, close enough that I could see the pulse jumping in his throat, close enough that I could smell that familiar scent of sandalwood and machine oil, close enough that I could see the sheen of tears in his gray eyes. "Yes," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "I killed him. I have been killing him every day for 14 years, and I will spend the rest of my life atoning for what I have done. The confession I had longed for, the admission of guilt I had traveled so far to obtain, should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like the ground opening beneath my feet, swallowing me into darkness I had not anticipated. I wanted to rage at him, to strike him, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain his betrayal had caused. But something in his voice, something in the devastation written across his features, held me back. "Tell me," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "Tell me everything." And so he did. He spoke for what felt like hours, his words tumbling out in a torrent of confession and grief that seemed to have been dammed up for over a decade. He told me how he had received my father's letter the morning of October 17th, how he had rushed to the airfield only to find that the Celestine had already departed, how he had stood on the ground, watching the ship disappear into the clouds, knowing with terrible certainty that he would never see his friend and mentor alive again. He told me about the consortium, the group of wealthy investors who had pressured my father to sell his patents, and when he refused, had decided to take matters into their own hands. They had needed someone inside the company, someone with access to the calculation engine, someone they could manipulate or threaten or bribe into doing their bidding. They had chosen Vane, who was young and ambitious and vulnerable in ways he had not fully understood until it was too late. "They came to me 6 months before the crash," he said, his voice hollow with remembered shame. "They told me that if I did not help them, they would destroy my family. My mother was ill, my sisters unmarried, our estate mortgaged to the point of ruin. They offered me money, security, a future I could not otherwise provide. And in return, all I had to do was look the other way. All I had to do was not ask questions about certain modifications being made to the navigation system. All I had to do was keep Edmund distracted, keep him from discovering what they were planning until it was too late. I did not know they meant to kill him. He looked at me then, and I saw in his eyes a desperation that seemed to border on madness. You must believe me, Clara. I thought they only wanted to cause a minor accident, something that would damage the ship and delay the inaugural voyage until Edmund was forced to sell. I never imagined they would sacrifice 43 lives to get what they wanted. When I received his letter, when I understood what they had really done, I tried to stop it. But I was too late. I am always too late. I wanted to believe him. God help me. Despite everything, I wanted to believe that the man standing before me was not a murderer, but a fool. Not a villain, but a victim of his own weakness and the machinations of more powerful men. But the evidence in my hands told a different story. If you tried to stop it, I said, my voice shaking with suppressed emotion, then why did you take his patents? Why did you build an empire on his grave? Why did you never tell anyone the truth about what really happened? Because they would have killed me too. He said it simply, without self-pity or excuse. Because they made it very clear that if I ever spoke of what I knew, they would destroy everything I cared about. My mother died that winter, but my sisters were still vulnerable. My reputation was already tarnished by association with the crash. If I had come forward, if I had tried to expose them, they would have silenced me permanently, and the truth would have died with me. He paused, seeming to gather his strength for what came next. So I made a different choice, he continued. I took the patents. I built the empire they wanted me to build. I made myself useful to them, indispensable, too valuable to eliminate. And all the while, I gathered evidence. Every letter, every document, every scrap of proof that might one day be enough to bring them down. I have been preparing for 14 years, Clara. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting until I was powerful enough that they could not destroy me without destroying themselves. He reached into his coat and drew out a key, the key to the drawer that now stood open before us. I kept your father's letters because they were proof of his innocence, he said, and I kept them hidden because they were also proof of my guilt. Every night, when I cannot sleep, I read them again. Every night, I remember what I did and what I failed to do. Every night, I ask your father's forgiveness, knowing I will never deserve it. He held the key out to me, and I saw that his hand was trembling. I have waited 14 years to tell someone the truth, he said. I never thought it would be you. Edmund's daughter. The one person with the most reason to hate me, the most reason to see me destroyed. But perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps you are the only one who can truly judge whether I deserve redemption or whether I should simply be consigned to the darkness where I belong. I took the key from his outstretched hand, feeling the weight of it against my palm. It was cold, surprisingly cold, as if it had been stored somewhere far from human warmth. I looked at it for a long moment, then looked up at the man who had given it to me. Who are they? I asked. The consortium. The men who really killed my father. Give me their names. And he did. The names he spoke were not unfamiliar to me. Lord Pemberton, the railway magnate. Sir Charles Whitmore, the banker. The Honourable Marcus Blackwood, Member of Parliament for one of the industrial boroughs. These were men of wealth and influence, pillars of society, names that appeared in the newspapers and the social pages, names that commanded respect and demanded deference. These were the men who had decided that my father's vision was too valuable to be left in his hands, too profitable to share with the man who had created it. These were the men who had looked at 43 innocent lives and calculated that they were an acceptable cost for securing their investment. I have files on all of them, Vane told me. Evidence of their involvement, their communications with each other, their financial arrangements. It has taken me 14 years to compile it, and I am not yet certain it is enough. They are careful men. They have protected themselves well. But I believe that with your father's ledger and his letters, combined with what I have gathered, we might finally have enough to expose them. We. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. Despite everything he had told me, despite the confession of his own complicity, he was speaking as if we were allies rather than enemies, as if my presence at Thornfield Hall had created a bond that transcended the history of betrayal and loss that lay between us. Why should I trust you? I asked, and I heard the tremor in my own voice, the uncertainty I had tried so hard to conceal. You have just confessed to being part of a conspiracy that killed my father. How do I know this is not another manipulation? How do I know you are not simply trying to use me the way they used you? He did not flinch from the accusation. I do not expect you to trust me, he said quietly. I have given you no reason to. All I can tell you is that I have spent 14 years living with the weight of what I have done, and that I would give anything at all to undo it. I cannot bring your father back. I cannot restore the years you have lost to grief and shame. but I can help you destroy the men who truly bear responsibility for his death. I can give you justice if you will let me. And perhaps, in doing so, I can begin to deserve the forgiveness I know I have no right to ask for. I should have refused. I should have taken the ledger and the letters and walked away. Should have gone to the authorities on my own and trusted that the evidence would speak for itself. But as I stood there in the dim light of the archive, looking into the eyes of the man who had broken my world apart, I knew that I could not do this alone. The consortium was too powerful, too well-connected, too skilled at making inconvenient people disappear. If I was going to bring them down, I needed an ally with resources and influence of his own. I needed someone who understood how these men thought, how they operated, what they feared. I needed Nathaniel Vane. And God forgive me, I wanted him too. "Very well," I said at last, and my voice sounded strange in my own ears, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. "Show me what you have. And we will see if together we can finish what my father started." The look that crossed his face then was one I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Relief, gratitude, and something else. Something that looked very much like hope rising from ashes, long thought cold. He reached out, hesitated, and then took my hand in his fingers warm and strong around mine. "Thank you," he said, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw him smile. It transformed his face, softened the hard lines and sharp angles, made him look younger and infinitely more vulnerable. "Whatever happens, Clara, I want you to know that meeting you has been the only truly good thing to come out of this tragedy. Your father would be proud of the woman you have become." I wanted to pull away. I wanted to remind him that he had no right to speak of my father, no right to offer me comfort or praise, but I could not make myself release his hand. I could not make myself look away from those gray eyes that held so much pain and so much desperate hope. "We will see," I said instead. "Show me what you have, and then we will decide together what must be done." That night, and for many nights thereafter, we worked side by side in his private study, surrounded by the evidence he had gathered over 14 years of patient, secret preparation. He showed me letters that implicated Pemberton in the sabotage scheme, financial records that traced Whitmore's illicit payments to the engineer who had tampered with the navigation system, parliamentary transcripts that revealed Blackwood's role in suppressing the official investigation into the crash. It was damning material, more than I had ever dared to hope for, and yet I understood why Vane had hesitated to use it. Each piece of evidence was circumstantial on its own. The letters could be dismissed as forgeries. The financial records could be explained away as legitimate business transactions. The parliamentary transcripts proved only that Blackwood had advocated for a particular conclusion, not that he had conspired to bring it about. To make a case that could not be dismissed, we would need something more direct, something that tied all three men together in a way that left no room for doubt. It was Vane who proposed the solution. The consortium was planning to invest in his new Skyrail project, the Manchester to Edinburgh line, whose construction I had watched from my window every day since my arrival. They believed that he was still their creature, still the frightened young man they had manipulated 14 years ago. If he could get them to discuss their role in the Celestine disaster openly, if he could record their words or obtain written confirmation of their involvement, we would have the evidence we needed. It was dangerous. If they suspected for even a moment that he was working against them, they would not hesitate to silence him permanently. But it was also the only way. And so we began to plan, to plot, to prepare for a confrontation that would either bring justice at last or destroy us both. During those long nights of work and planning, something shifted between us. The barriers I had erected around my heart began to crumble, worn away by proximity, by shared purpose, by the gradual revelation of who Nathaniel Vane truly was beneath the cold exterior he showed the world. I learned that he had a dry, unexpected wit that emerged when he was tired or distracted. I learned that he could play the piano with surprising skill, that he read poetry when he could not sleep, that he had once dreamed of being an artist before duty and circumstance forced him onto a different path. I learned that his nightmares were not merely guilt, but grief, that he had loved my father like a brother, and that losing him had carved a wound that had never fully healed. And he learned about me, about the years I had spent in Cheapside, invisible and forgotten, about the hatred that had sustained me and the loneliness that had nearly destroyed me, about the girl I had been before the crash and the woman I had forced myself to become in its aftermath. He listened without judgment, without pity, with an attentiveness that made me feel seen for the first time in 14 years. One night, as we sat together in his study reviewing a particularly complex financial document, he set down his pen and looked at me with an expression I had come to know well, that searching, assessing gaze that seemed to see through all my defenses. "Why did you really come here, Clara?" he asked. "Before you knew the truth, before you found the letters, what did you hope to accomplish?" I wanted to lie to him. Some part of me still believed that showing vulnerability to this man was dangerous, that admitting the depth of my hatred would give him power over me that I could not afford to surrender. But I had lied enough. I had pretended enough. And in the quiet intimacy of that candle-lit room, with the evidence of our shared mission spread across the desk between us, I found that I no longer had the strength for pretense. "I wanted to destroy you," I said simply. "I believed you had murdered my father, and I wanted to make you pay. I was going to find evidence of your guilt and use it to bring you down, no matter what it cost me. I was prepared to sacrifice everything, even my own life, to see you ruined." He nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what he had expected. "And now," he asked, "now that you know the truth, what do you want?" The question hung between us, weighted with meaning I could not pretend to ignore. I looked at him, at this man who had been my enemy and had become my ally, who had confessed to terrible things and yet shown me tenderness I had not known I was capable of receiving. I thought of all the reasons I should still hate him, all the ways he had failed my father and failed himself. And I thought of the way my heart raced when he was near, the way my breath caught when our eyes met, the way I had begun to count the hours until I could be in his presence again. "I want justice," I said, and my voice was barely a whisper. "I want the truth to be known. I want my father's name restored. But I also—" I stopped, unable to finish the sentence, unable to name the other thing I wanted, the thing that seemed impossible and inevitable all at once. He rose from his chair and came around the desk to stand before me, so close that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the rapid rise and fall of his chest. He reached out and touched my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek, and I saw my own impossible longing reflected in his eyes. "I know," he said softly. "I know, because I want it too. From the moment you walked into this house, I have felt something I thought I had lost the capacity to feel. You make me want to be better than I am. You make me believe that perhaps, even after everything I have done, redemption might still be possible. I should have pulled away. I should have reminded both of us that whatever we felt, whatever connection had grown between us, it could not change the past. My father was still dead. Vane was still complicit in his death. The blood on his hands could not be washed away by longing or desire. But when he bent his head and kissed me, softly at first, then with increasing urgency, I did not pull away. I kissed him back with all the passion and desperation I had kept locked inside me for 14 years, all the grief and rage and terrible hope that I had never allowed myself to feel. I kissed him as if my life depended on it, as if his mouth against mine was the only thing keeping me from drowning in the darkness that had surrounded me for so long. His arms came around me, pulling me closer, and I felt the strength in them, the barely contained power that he held in check with such careful control. His lips were warm and demanding, and he tasted of brandy and something sweeter, something that was uniquely him. I wound my fingers through his dark hair, feeling its unexpected softness, and heard him groan against my mouth, a sound that sent shivers cascading down my spine. Time ceased to have meaning. The study, the evidence spread across the desk, the weight of history and betrayal and vengeance, all of it faded until there was nothing left but this moment, this man, this kiss that seemed to rewrite everything I thought I knew about myself and what I was capable of feeling. When we finally broke apart, both of us gasping for air, I saw my own shock and wonder reflected in his storm-gray eyes. When at last we broke apart, both of us breathless and trembling, I looked into his eyes and said the words I had never expected to say. "I do not forgive you," I said, and my voice was rough, unsteady, the voice of a woman who had just discovered that the ground beneath her feet was not as solid as she had believed. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. But I am willing to try. I am willing to see what we might become if we can find a way to build something new on the ashes of what was destroyed. He pressed his forehead against mine, his breath warm on my lips. "That is more than I deserve," he said. "But I will take it. I will take whatever you are willing to give me, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn the rest." We did not speak of love that night. The word was too large, too fraught with history and complication to be spoken so soon. But as I lay awake in my room in the hours before dawn, I knew that love was what I felt, terrifying and transformative and utterly beyond my control. I loved Nathaniel Vane, and whatever happened next, whatever the consortium did when we exposed them, whatever price we paid for our pursuit of justice, I would face it with him at my side. The opportunity came sooner than we had anticipated. In early June, Lord Pemberton announced that he would be hosting a grand celebration at his country estate to mark the completion of the first phase of the Manchester-Edinburgh Skyrail. All the major investors would be in attendance, including Whitmore and Blackwood, and Vane was expected to be the guest of honor. It was the perfect occasion for the confrontation we had been planning, a gathering of all three conspirators in one place, away from the scrutiny of London society. We prepared meticulously. Vane would maneuver the three men into a private meeting on the pretext of discussing the next phase of investment. I would be hidden nearby with a stenographer's device, a clever machine that could record spoken words on a wax cylinder, ready to capture their confession when Vane steered the conversation toward the Celestine. We had rehearsed every possible scenario, every potential objection, every way the plan could go wrong. By the time we departed for Pemberton's estate, I was as ready as I would ever be. But nothing could have prepared me for what we discovered when we arrived. Pemberton's estate was called Ashdown Manor, a sprawling Georgian pile set amid extensive grounds that included gardens, a lake, and a private airfield, where several of the consortium's sky rails were berthed. The house itself was magnificent, all white stone and classical columns, filled with artwork and antiquities that spoke of wealth accumulated over generations. We were greeted by liveried servants and shown to our rooms with all the ceremony due to honored guests. It was that evening, during the formal dinner that preceded the next day's celebration, that I saw her for the first time. She was standing at the far end of the ballroom, dressed in black despite the festive occasion, her face pale as moonlight and her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. She was young, no more than 20, with dark hair piled high on her head and a beauty that seemed somehow unnatural, too perfect to belong to the living world. Around her, the other guests moved and laughed and danced, utterly oblivious to her presence, as if she existed in some separate reality that only I could perceive. I watched as a woman in emerald silk walked directly through the space where she stood, passing through her as if she were made of nothing more substantial than smoke. The woman in emerald did not pause, did not shiver, did not show any sign that she had noticed anything amiss. But the figure in black remained, her dark eyes never leaving mine, her expression one of urgent, desperate pleading. I blinked, and she was gone, vanished as if she had never been there at all. The space where she had stood was empty now, occupied only by a potted palm and the reflection of chandelier light on the polished floor. I told myself I had imagined it. The stress of our mission, the fear of what we were about to attempt, had combined to produce a hallucination, nothing more. But as the evening wore on, I saw her again and again. In the corner of the library where the gentlemen gathered to smoke. On the terrace outside the drawing room where the ladies took their tea. Always watching, always silent, always disappearing the moment I tried to approach her. It was not until I retired to my room that I finally understood what I was seeing. The woman appeared beside my bed as I was preparing to sleep, her form faintly translucent in the candlelight, her eyes holding a sorrow so profound it seemed to radiate from her like cold. She did not speak, but she raised one pale hand and pointed toward the window, toward the airfield where the sky rails were berthed. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from very far away, she said a single word: "Remember." I should have been terrified. I should have screamed, should have fled, should have done any of the things that a rational person would do when confronted by an apparition. But somehow, I was not afraid. There was something familiar about her, something that tugged at the edges of my memory like a half-forgotten dream. I had seen this face before. I had known this woman. But where? When? The answer came to me as she began to fade, her form dissolving like mist in the morning sun. She had been in the newspapers 14 years ago, her portrait printed alongside my father's in the coverage of the Celestine disaster. She had been one of the passengers, one of the 43 souls lost when the ship fell from the sky. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, Sir Charles Whitmore's daughter. The ghost of Eleanor Whitmore came to me again that night, and the night after, and every night I spent at Ashdown Manor. She showed me things I could not have known, led me to places I should not have been able to find, whispered secrets that had been buried for 14 years. She showed me the hidden room beneath the airfield where Pemberton kept the original navigation mechanism from the Celestine, preserved as a trophy of his victory. She showed me the letters Eleanor herself had written to her father before the crash, begging him to reconsider his investment in a scheme she had somehow discovered. She showed me the truth about why Eleanor had been on the Celestine at all. She had not been a victim of random fate. She had been silenced. Eleanor had learned about the conspiracy and had threatened to expose it. Her own father, horrified at first but ultimately unwilling to sacrifice his fortune and reputation, had arranged for her to be on the inaugural voyage. He had murdered his own daughter to protect his secrets, and the guilt of it had driven him half mad in the years since. The man who moved through society with such confidence, who wielded such power, who sat at the right hand of lords and ministers, was haunted by the ghost of the child he had killed. Now, Eleanor seemed to say, though her lips did not move and no sound reached my ears, now you understand. Now you have everything you need. Now you can finish what I could not. The confrontation took place on the final night of the celebration in Pemberton's private study, where the 3 conspirators had gathered at Vane's request. I was hidden in an adjoining room, the stenographer's device ready, my heart pounding so hard I was certain they must be able to hear it through the wall. The device was a marvel of engineering, a brass cylinder covered in wax that could capture the vibrations of human speech and preserve them for later playback. Vane had obtained it from an inventor in Austria, a man who claimed it would revolutionize the legal profession by allowing perfect transcription of testimony. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. The adjoining room was small and dark, little more than a storage closet filled with decanters and glassware. I had concealed myself behind a rack of bottles, my eye pressed to a small hole I had drilled in the paneling during an unobserved moment that afternoon. The hole was tiny, barely large enough to see through, but it gave me a clear view of the study and the 3 men who would determine my fate. Through a small hole I had drilled in the paneling, I could see everything, I could hear everything, and when Vane began to speak, I recorded it all. He entered the room last, after the three conspirators had already settled themselves in leather chairs before the fire. They looked comfortable, confident, like men who had gathered to discuss routine matters of business. Pemberton had a cigar in hand, its smoke curling toward the ceiling in lazy spirals. Whitmore nursed a glass of port, his banker's face set in its customary expression of calculating attention. Blackwood stood by the window, his politician's smile firmly in place, watching the other two with the air of a man who trusted no one. He played his part brilliantly. This man I loved, this man who had once been their creature and was now their nemesis. He spoke of the new Sky Rail line, of the unprecedented profits it would generate, of the opportunities for expansion that lay ahead. And then, casually, as if it were merely an afterthought, he mentioned the Celestine. "We have done well," he said, his voice carrying through the study with perfect clarity. "Ever since that unfortunate business with Ashworth. He was brilliant, of course, but far too principled for his own good. If he had simply agreed to our terms, none of this unpleasantness would have been necessary." Pemberton laughed, a cruel sound that made my stomach turn. "Ashworth was a fool," he said. "He thought his precious patents belonged to him, as if ideas could be owned by a single man. We did the world a favor when we removed him from the equation. His technology was too important to be held hostage by one engineer's scruples." "And the passengers?" Vane pressed, his tone still light, still casual. "The 43 people who died with him? Were they also removed from the equation?" There was a moment of silence. I saw Whitmore's face go pale, saw Blackwood's eyes dart toward the door as if contemplating escape. But Pemberton only smiled, the smile of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Collateral damage," he said, "regrettable but necessary. You understand these things, Vane. You have always understood. The progress of civilization cannot be held back by sentiment. Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good, including your own daughter, Charles." Vane's voice had changed now, hardened into something cold and dangerous. "Eleanor was on that ship because she had discovered what you were planning. You put her there knowing she would die. You murdered your own child to protect your investment." The silence that followed was absolute. I saw Whitmore rise from his chair, his face contorted with rage and terror, saw Blackwood reach for the pistol he wore at his belt, saw Pemberton's smile finally falter as he realized that this conversation had taken a turn he had not anticipated. And then Eleanor appeared. She materialized in the center of the room, between Vane and the three conspirators, as solid and real as any living woman. She wore the same black dress I had seen at the ball, her dark hair still piled high, her pale face still bearing that expression of urgent, desperate intensity. But now there was something else in her eyes, something triumphant, something fierce, the look of a woman who had waited 14 years for this moment and would not be denied. The temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath misting in the air, could feel the cold seeping through the wall against which I pressed. The fire in the grate guttered and nearly went out, its flames shrinking to mere embers, as if something were drawing the warmth from the very air. The gas lamps flickered wildly, casting mad shadows across the walls, and then, one by one, they dimmed until the room was lit only by the dying fire and the ghostly luminescence that seemed to emanate from Eleanor herself. Whitmore screamed, a sound of pure animal terror, and stumbled backward until he struck the wall. His glass of port fell from nerveless fingers and shattered on the floor, the dark liquid spreading across the carpet like blood. His face had gone gray, the color of old ash, and I could see his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been denial, repeating the same word over and over again. "Eleanor, Eleanor, Eleanor." Blackwood fired his pistol, but the bullet passed through her without effect, burying itself in the paneling behind her with a sound like a thunderclap. He fired again and again, until the chamber was empty and the room stank of gunpowder and fear. Eleanor did not flinch. She did not even seem to notice. Her eyes were fixed on the father who had betrayed her, and in their depths I saw something that might have been pity, or might have been contempt, or might have been both. Only Pemberton stood his ground, though I could see his hands trembling as he faced the specter of his crimes. "Father," Eleanor said, and her voice was not the whisper I had heard in my room, but something vast and terrible, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Did you think I would forget? Did you think I would forgive? You sent me to my death to protect your gold. And now you will face the judgment you have escaped for 14 years. The room erupted into chaos. Whitmore collapsed, clutching his chest, his face gone gray with the onset of what I would later learn was a massive heart attack. Blackwood fled through the door, only to be met by the constables Vane had arranged to be waiting outside. Pemberton alone remained standing, his eyes fixed on the ghost of the woman he had helped to kill, his expression shifting from fear to defiance to something that might have been relief. "I have carried you with me every day," he said to her, his voice barely audible. "Every day since you died. I have heard your voice in my dreams and seen your face in every crowd. If you have come to take me, then take me. I am tired of running from your memory." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, and I saw something in her expression that I had not expected. Not hatred, not triumph, something closer to pity. "I have not come to take you," she said. "I have come to set myself free. The truth will be known now. The living will render their judgment. What happens to your soul is not my concern." She turned then and looked directly at me, though I was hidden behind the wall. She smiled, a smile of profound gratitude and release, and then she was gone. The room felt suddenly empty, as if something essential had departed from it, leaving only the wreckage of 3 ruined men and the evidence that would finally bring them to justice. The trials that followed consumed the better part of a year. Whitmore died before he could face judgment, his heart giving out completely on the night of the confrontation, found the next morning slumped in his chair in the room where Eleanor's ghost had appeared to him for the last time. His face, according to the servants who discovered him, bore an expression of such profound terror that the housemaid who first entered the room refused ever to speak of what she had seen. Blackwood and Pemberton were not so fortunate as to escape justice through death. The evidence we had gathered, combined with the recording from the stenographer's device and the documents Eleanor had led me to discover, was more than enough to secure convictions. The trials were a sensation, filling the newspapers for months, drawing crowds to the Old Bailey who waited for hours in the cold and rain simply to catch a glimpse of the accused as they were led to and from the courtroom. I testified at both trials, my voice steady even as I recounted the details of my deception, my investigation, my discovery of the truth. I spoke of my father, of the man he had been, of the dreams he had pursued, and the terrible price he had paid for them. I spoke of Eleanor Whitmore, though I was careful to present her guidance as a series of fortunate discoveries rather than supernatural intervention. The courts were not ready to accept the testimony of ghosts, and I would not have their skepticism cast doubt on the evidence that would bring the conspirators to justice. Blackwood was sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in the conspiracy, his political career destroyed, his name a byword for corruption and betrayal. He showed no remorse in the courtroom, maintaining to the end that he had acted in the national interest, that the progress represented by the sky rails justified whatever methods had been used to secure them. The judge was not impressed by this argument. Neither was the public. Pemberton, as the principal architect of the sabotage, was hanged at Newgate Prison on a gray morning in February of 1888. I did not attend the execution. By that time, I had other concerns, other hopes, other reasons to look toward the future rather than dwelling on the past. The scandal of the trials had rocked society to its core, but it had also achieved what I had sought for so long. My father's name was cleared. The truth about the Celestine was finally known. Edmund Ashworth was remembered not as a madman or a fool, but as a visionary who had been murdered for his brilliance. A hero who had tried to save his passengers, even as powerful men conspired to silence him forever. Nathaniel Vane's role in the conspiracy was also revealed, though the courts treated him with more leniency than his co-conspirators. His testimony had been instrumental in securing the convictions. His evidence had provided the foundation for the prosecution's case. And his genuine remorse, evident to all who witnessed his appearances in the courtroom, had earned him a measure of sympathy from both judge and jury. He was stripped of his knighthood and required to pay substantial reparations to the families of those who had died on the Celestine, but he faced no prison sentence. The court ruled that he had been as much a victim as a perpetrator, a young man manipulated by older and more powerful forces, and that his years of secret work to expose the conspiracy constituted a form of atonement. It was a judgment I could accept. It was, in truth, a judgment I had hoped for. Because by the time the trials concluded, Nathaniel Vane was no longer merely my ally in the pursuit of justice. He was the man I loved, the man I had chosen, the man I intended to spend the rest of my life with. We were married in the spring of 1888 in the small chapel at Thornfield Hall, where generations of Vanes had exchanged their vows. There was no grand society wedding, no parade of aristocratic guests, no coverage in the society pages. We wanted none of that. What we wanted was simple and profound: to begin again, to build something new, to honor the memory of those we had lost by creating a future worthy of their sacrifice. The chapel was ancient, dating back to the 14th century, with thick stone walls that held the cold of centuries and stained glass windows that transformed the morning light into jewels. I wore my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit me, its ivory silk yellowed with age, but still beautiful. Nathaniel wore a simple dark suit, his hair for once properly combed, his gray eyes bright with an emotion that he did not try to hide. Mrs. Blackwood wept throughout the ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and muttering about the happiness of the old house at finally seeing its master wed. The rest of the household staff lined the back of the chapel, their faces wreathed in smiles, clearly relieved that the man they served had found something other than work and ghosts to occupy his nights. When the vicar pronounced us husband and wife, when Nathaniel bent his head and kissed me in the sight of God and our gathered witnesses, I felt something release in my chest that I had carried for so long I had forgotten it was there. The weight of 14 years of grief and rage and desperate longing lifted from my shoulders, and in its place there was only this: love, imperfect and hard-won, but real. More real than anything I had felt since the day I learned my father was dead. The Skyrail Company was reorganized and renamed. Ashworth Vane Aeronautics, we called it, a partnership between a ghost and the living, between the past and the present, between the dream my father had died for and the reality we were determined to create. The Manchester-Edinburgh line was completed not as a monument to the consortium's greed, but as a testament to my father's vision. On the day of its inaugural voyage, I stood on the platform with my husband beside me and watched the first passenger car lift into the sky, and I wept with a mixture of grief and joy that I had never expected to feel. My father would never see what we had built. He would never know that his name had been restored, that his murderers had faced justice, that his daughter had found love in the most unlikely of places. But somehow, standing there in the mountain wind with the sky rail humming overhead, I felt his presence beside me. I felt his approval. I felt his peace. And I knew that Eleanor was at peace as well. I had not seen her since the night of the confrontation, and I knew I never would again. She had done what she needed to do. She had guided me to the truth, had given me the tools to expose the men who had killed her, and then she had let go of the world that had treated her so cruelly. Wherever she was now, I hoped she had found the rest that had been denied her in life. There were still shadows, of course. There always are. Nathaniel's nightmares did not disappear with the trials. The guilt he carried did not dissolve simply because the courts had shown him mercy. There were nights when I woke to find him standing at the window, staring out at the stars, his face haunted by memories that would never fully release him. There were moments when I caught him looking at me with an expression of such profound sorrow that it took my breath away. Moments when I knew he was wondering if he truly deserved the happiness we had found together. I understood those moments because I shared them. There were times when I would look at him across the breakfast table, or beside me in bed, or walking with me through the gardens as the sky rails hummed overhead, and I would feel a sudden, irrational surge of grief. Grief for my father, who would never meet the man I had married. Grief for the girl I had been before the crash, who had believed in a world where justice prevailed and evil was punished. Grief for the years we had both lost, the years of suspicion and loneliness and quiet desperation that could never be reclaimed. But then he would turn to me, and I would see in his eyes the same mixture of sorrow and gratitude and impossible hope that I felt in my own heart, and the grief would ease, not disappear. Never that, but settle into something I could carry, something we could carry together. On those nights, I would go to him. I would take his hand and lead him back to bed. I would hold him in my arms and whisper the words I had come to believe with all my heart. The past cannot be changed, I would tell him, but the future is still being written. We cannot undo what has been done, but we can choose what we do with the time we have left. And I choose you. I choose us. I choose to believe that even broken things can be made whole again. He would look at me then, this man who had been my enemy and had become my salvation, and I would see in his eyes the same impossible hope that I felt in my own heart. We were both survivors, both scarred by loss and betrayal, both carrying wounds that would never fully heal. But we had found each other. We had found a way forward, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. I am writing this account now, in the summer of 1890, sitting in the study at Thornfield Hall, where so much of our story unfolded. Nathaniel is in his workshop, tinkering with designs for a new generation of sky rails that will one day circle the globe. Our daughter, Eleanor, named for the ghost who guided me to the truth, is sleeping in her nursery upstairs, watched over by the same Mrs. Blackwood who once warned me about the restlessness of this house. The gaslight flickers on my desk, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and outside my window I can see the silhouette of the Sky Rail station against the darkening sky. I began this story by saying that I learned when I was 12 years old that the sky could fall. I know now that I was wrong. The sky did not fall when the Celestine crashed. It shattered, yes, into a million pieces of grief and rage and despair. But it did not fall. It cannot fall. The sky is vast and eternal, far beyond the power of mortal men to destroy. What fell was my innocence. What fell was my faith in a world where goodness was rewarded and evil was punished. What fell was my capacity to trust, to love, to believe that the future held anything but darkness. And what rose from those ashes was something I could never have imagined. A truth more complicated than I had expected, a love more powerful than I had believed possible, a life built not on vengeance but on justice, not on hatred but on hope, not on the past but on the promise of all the days yet to come. My name is Clara Ashworth Vane. I am the daughter of a dreamer, the wife of a man who is both my enemy and my salvation, the mother of a child who will never know the shadows that haunted her parents. I am a survivor. I am a seeker of truth. And I am, at long last, at peace. The sky rails still run through the mountains of Britain, carrying passengers in safety and comfort along the routes my father first imagined. When I watch them pass overhead, gleaming in the sunlight or glowing like lanterns against the night, I think of all the lives they represent, all the dreams they carry, all the hopes they fulfill. And I think of my father looking down from wherever he is now, and I know that he is proud. The route ledger of the Celestine sits in a glass case in the entrance hall of the Ashworth Vane Aeronautical Museum, which we established last year in the building where my father's workshop once stood. The museum occupies a converted warehouse near the London docks, a cavernous space that we have filled with the artifacts of my father's life and work. His original blueprints hang on the walls, protected behind glass. The tools he used, his compass and slide rule, and the brass instruments with which he measured the sky, are displayed in cases beneath carefully positioned lights. A scale model of the Celestine dominates the central hall, suspended from the ceiling by invisible wires, its silver hull gleaming in the gaslight as if it were truly flying. And in that glass case at the entrance, where every visitor must pass it, lies the ledger that changed everything. The leather cover is worn now, the pages yellowed with age, but my father's handwriting is still clearly visible, a testament to the man he was and the truth he tried to tell. A small plaque beneath the case tells the story, as much of it as we thought the public should know. It speaks of sabotage and conspiracy, of justice delayed but not denied, of a daughter who refused to let her father's memory be buried with his bones. It does not mention Eleanor. It does not mention ghosts or apparitions or the cold breath of the dead against my cheek. Some truths are too strange for plaques, too private for public consumption. Eleanor's role in uncovering the conspiracy belongs to me alone, a secret I carry in my heart like a precious stone, a reminder that the world is stranger and more wondrous than we often allow ourselves to believe. Visitors come from all over the world to see it, to read the words my father wrote in his final desperate attempt to save his passengers, to understand the truth about the crash that changed the course of British aviation. They leave with tears in their eyes and wonder in their hearts, and they carry with them the knowledge that even in darkness, even in despair, even when all seems lost, there is always the possibility of light. That is the lesson my father taught me, though I did not understand it for many years. That is the lesson Nathaniel taught me, in his own way, through his own long journey from complicity to redemption. That is the lesson Eleanor taught me, the ghost who would not rest until justice was done. Love is stronger than death. Truth is stronger than lies. And hope, that fragile, persistent, indomitable thing, is stronger than all the cruelty and greed and darkness in the world. I know that now. I believe it with all my heart, and I will spend the rest of my days living as if it were true, because it is, because it must be, because there is no other way to live that is worthy of the sacrifices that were made, the losses that were endured, the love that was, against all odds, found. This is my story, this is my truth, and this, at last, is my peace.